We're going to be making this even count peyote stitch bracelet. And even count simply means that you started out with an even number of beads rather than an odd number of beads. And the odd count peyote has a couple of slightly different steps that have to be done, which I'm going to show you later. But we're going to start out talking about beads. The size of the beads follows the old or the current gauge numbering system of wire, and that means that the higher the number, the smaller the wire. So for example, these are size 15 beads, these are size 11, and this is size 6. So they're very small, but for the biggest number. And this is a seed bead, which means that the bead has rounded edges, compared to this, which is a delica, which looks like a little tube. When you're doing the peyote stitch, both work very well, but you can see that there ends up being a different appearance to it because the delicas, being like little tubes, lay together like little bricks. Now the seed beads have that numbering system, but when you start getting into things like the fire polish beads or pearls or stone beads or these bicones, that's when the numbering system switches to being measured in millimeters. So for example, this is a 2 millimeter fire polish bead. These are cool because you can see that they're sort of an oval shape, but they're faceted. And this is a 3 millimeter fire polish bead. These are 4 millimeter pearls, and this is a glass bead. This is a 7 millimeter, and these are bicones, which are crystals, and you can see that they're like a little diamond, a triangle shape, and they're very faceted to make them very shiny. This is a stone bead, and this bead, where it's slightly squashed, is referred to as a rondelle. Now these 15, sometimes referred to as 0.15 or 15-0, those tiny beads are very often used in conjunction with another system. Here they're used as a sort of a junction between this fishnet and on the other side. They're also used to fill in little gaps and to finish off the edges. This is a bicone as well, and you can maybe this one you can see a bit more easily. When dealing with pearls, the trick is that when you rub the beads together, if it slides very smoothly, you know that that is not a genuine actual pearl. Compared to these, when you rub them together, it actually feels gritty. And that's because that is the nacre, or N-A-C-R-E, which is the lining of the inside of the shell that is being built up to make the pearl. You don't want to do that too often, because we are actually, whenever you rub it, you're actually starting to rub off some of that finish. So when you're storing your genuine pearls, don't leave them sitting against each other. Have them separated so that they're not rubbing against each other, so that you don't wear them away. The first step now is to deal with your thread. Now that you've probably already considered your selection of beads, the first thing to consider is your color of the thread. You want to have a color that is going to blend in with your bead choice. For example, for these colors, I would use one that is smoke compared to this color that is referred to as crystal. The difference being that it's going to show up in your beadwork, but more importantly at the end. I started this with using the smoke colored and then switched to the white, just so that you can see the difference, because you want to make sure that the thread is going to be as invisible as possible. The other problem is that when you have it with transparent beads, the color of the thread is going to make a large difference. There's those crystal bicones are put onto a white thread, and here it's been put onto a black thread. and especially with, obviously with this crystal, but with any transparent bead, the color of the thread is going to affect the color of the beads. And here, obviously, you can see, first of all, you can see the thread through the bead, but it changes the luster of the bead itself. So you want to avoid having the wrong color or the color of the thread that is going to affect the beads that you're working with. The next consideration of dealing with your thread is the size of the thread. When you're doing small beads like this, just with the peyote stitch, you can very easily use either a 4-pound or a 6-pound test. Now this is a fire line. This is my go-to thread. I find it very durable and it's stiff enough that it works very well for me. There's an 8-pound and the 10-pound. You want to use, the size of your thread is going to depend on the size of the bead. For beads this large, I'm going to use something like a 10-pound, a minimum of 8-pound, 10-pound, because that gives me more strength and body to the piece that I'm working with. The 4-pound you're going to use when you have a lot of stitching or sewing to do. With this bracelet, for example, there's a lot of stitching. These beads, first of all, these beads are very small, but there's also a lot of work that has been done on top. So because you're sewing through beads perhaps 2 or 3 times, you want to use a 4-pound test or something that size so that you can actually work with it and get through all the beads. That being said, your next choice is your needles. For that 4-pound test, these beading needles are very, very slender, and you can see that it's so narrow that that should go through the beads with the thread without a problem. With the 10-pound test, you're not going to get that through those tiny needles, so I'm just actually using these normal hand sewing needles, but the most narrow needle that I can use, but with a large enough eye that the thread is going to get through it. There's a lot of people who like to wax their thread. With the fire line, I don't find that it's necessary, but if you're using some of these very fine nylon threads, then it's probable that you will find that it's going to work better for you. And the thread is simply run through the wax before it's sewn in, and actually you can feel the difference as soon as you do that. You can feel that there's more strength to the thread and it's going to adhere a bit better to the needles. Another needle that is very interesting is this, referred to this big eye needle. What's interesting about this one is it's actually 2 very thin pieces of wire, so it's very easy to obviously to get it threaded. But this is actually a stringing needle that is used to accomplish this kind of work. So if you're going to be stringing a lot of beads, you want to use something like this, then you can get more beads on to the needle at the same time. One of the most interesting needles that I find, this is a thread that, or it's actually referred to as a cord, that is used to do pearls. And you can actually see that there's actually a needle at the end of the cord, so that you don't, because the cord is so thick, it's actually got a needle that's built into it. So when you're using this, you're going to put all of your pearls to the far end of the strand, and you keep working up to the top, because you use this once and you can't rethread it, so you don't start at the end and then cut off the unused portion because there's no needle to it. So this is very interesting, and I've used this quite a few times, and it's actually quite fun and interesting to use that thread. To put bead size into perspective, this is the same pattern. This is size 11 delicas and this is size 6. So it's actually quite amazing, the difference in size. Nothing has been changed except for the size of the beads. Now to consider the clasp. Obviously you're going to find millions of different kinds of clasps that you could, or options for clasps that you could use. This one is referred to as a box clasp, and you can see that it has 2 rings on it. And to attach it to this bracelet, I simply added a couple of jump rings into the sewn part of the bracelet. This is a slide clasp. What's interesting about this one is that this little tube opens up and the beads are slid into the tube and then the cap is closed. And to open it, you just pull that and it comes apart. That is the same as this one, but a little bit larger. This just had to be sewn on. And this also is sewn on. And this is just a fun thing. This is actually magnetic. There's all kinds of fabulous things like this. That's where it connects. So it's actually kind of heavy, but this very often my choice of clasp is that this is going to be the centerpiece of the bracelet, which I wear on the top of my wrist rather than hiding it. Whereas with this one, the bracelet, the beadwork, is what I'm going to show on my wrist. Same with this one. But with this one, I will wear with the clasp on the top. This one I will wear with the clasp on the top. But this one I have on the bottom because it's the bracelet that I want to show off. Now these two clasps, this one is a pull or slide clasp. But what's interesting about this one is note the position of the loops that are going to be used to attach to the bracelet. So here you will either sew your fabric on top of it or to the end of it. You could use jump rings to turn it, basically to turn it the other direction, which is what I did for that one. This is referred to as a horizontal clasp, whereas this is a vertical. And you can see the difference in the direction that the rings are laying. This one is actually magnetic. It's very difficult to pull this out. And this one has a very, very strong magnet. This is actually quite expensive. And with that, you can see how the beads end up just laying between the rings. So the bracelet is better integrated into the clasp rather than it just being a support in a sense, which has to be sort of hidden. I have now chosen my beads that I'm going to be using. I have a size 8 delicas in ivory and size 8 delicas in gold that I'm going to be using. And I first of all need to decide whether I'm going to use the ivory as my base color with the gold as an accent or vice versa. And this bracelet, you can see my base color is a matte bead with the shiny bead as a contrast. I think you can see that how the light changes the color on that. Whereas this one, it's the other way. This is mostly the shiny bead with the matte accent. And to get started, I'm going to take my clasp of choice and I'm just going to string a bunch of the beads, and I'm using that because of the size of the bead, as I mentioned before. I'm going to use the 10-pound test, and I'm going to use the crystal color because it's going to not show up as much as if I were to use the black. So I'm just going to pick up, I have to show you first of all that I did put on my stop bead. It's just a bead, anything bead just there to stop your beads from sliding off as you're working. I like to leave about a good 8-inch tail. This is what we're going to use to close off, to attach any clasp and to tie things off. So I've got my stop bead in place, and I'm just going to pick up a number of beads, and we're going to start this just to figure out how many beads we actually need for the width of the bracelet depending on the size of the clasp. Normally people will tell you, well, if you're making a 2.5 inch bracelet, then you have to find a 2.5 inch clasp, but I don't work that direction. So I'm just going to, and I found that this works for me. So I don't have it quite enough yet. And I'm going to add 2 more and then count it. Now when we count, we want to make sure that we have an even number, because we're going to start working with an even count peyote rather than the odd count. So I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Good. And if it comes up, if your bead count is odd, then add 1 more bead to make it even. It's better to have 1 bead too long rather than too short. You want it to fit that way rather than that way. Now this string of beads, is actually your first 2 rows of your peyote stitch. And I've decided that I'm going to use the ivory as my base color and the gold as my accent. So to get started, it's going to look messy at first, but we'll work that out later. To get started, my mantra is skip 1 and pick 1. So I'm going to move that first one out of the way, pick up a bead, and sew it through the next bead. Again, skip 1 and pick 1 and go down through that bead. Again, skip 1 and pick 1. Some people refer to this as going down the throat because of the direction that we're sending the needle through the bead. Again, skip 1 and pick 1. And skip 1 and pick 1. Skip 1 and pick 1. Skip 1 and pick 1. Now if you have 1 more bead left as a result of this, you've either made a mistake in adding your beads or you miscounted at the very beginning. Now to make sure that this is all correct, I'm going to just line things up, and you can see that bead. You can see both strands have gone through it, so that's my base bead. And now these 2 are going to sit side by side. The next bead is a single, and you can see that both strands have gone through that. And then we've got 2 that are sitting side by side. A single and 2 side by side. A single and 2 side by side. A single, and you can already see that everything's working out the way it's supposed to at the top. And so I'm just going to give all this a pull down and see how it lines up. There's my single, 2 and there, and here are the last 2. And we want these 2 arranged side by side. I'm just going to give my thread a pull and make that guy lay down flat with his neighbor. Okay. This is your first 2 rows of your peyote stitch has already established. And what you're going to be doing all the time is to pick up a bead, and you're going to sew through each bead that is sticking up. If you want to call it a picot, or the one that's bold and sticking his head up, whatever works for you. And now I'm going to go up that bead and pick up another one and go through the one that is sticking up. And you can see it's already starting to lay nice and flat. And I like to just get this base row established, and then I'm going to show you the pattern to make it, the pattern that I'm going to show you will make it look like it's random, but it's sort of organized random. Now this is what some people refer to as going up the bum, because we're going up that way instead. And you'll find the direction that you hold your beads, your work, is entirely up to whatever works for you. Now you can see that it's laying quite nice and flat. Be careful not to twist it and start going down the other side. Now that we've come to this one, you can see just by pulling it, I'm creating a bit more tension. I'm going to pick up one more bead, and now I'm actually starting on the next row. And now I'm back to going down the throat. And I'm going to pick up one more. Actually, I'm going to pick up one of these now. And once I've got to have a couple of beads in place, the last bead that I put on here, I'm just going to pull that up and give it a bit of a tug. And that helps to keep my tension for the last row in place. Now my pattern that I use is one base color, one contrast color, two base color, one contrast, three base color, and one contrast, and four base color, and one contrast. And this is the pattern, and it's an organized pattern that will look random once you really get going in your work. So now that I've done one base and one contrast, I'm going to do two base, and one contrast. I'm quite comfortable keeping my work this way. Some people will always flip it because they always want to be working in the same direction. And some people prefer to work sideways. So when you start working, you will find whatever method works best for you to maintain control and to be comfortable for you. So we did two base, one. So now I'm going to do three base, and one contrast. And again, this last bead, I'm going to give that a bit of a tug. And when you're doing that, try to maintain the same pressure as you're pulling on that, so that you end up with a very nice straight edge. And now I'm going to do four base and then one contrast. Oh, you can see my thread got tangled down here. I'm just going to make sure that that comes up. Another thing is I find that you can work with the length of thread for beading whatever's comfortable for you. Use as long a thread as you possibly can. That way you have fewer tie-offs to do. But I found that having a long tail, this gets tangled and creates a mess. So however long thread you're going to be using, just keep your tail not much longer than that, because otherwise it will get tangled up and make knots, and you're not going to be happy. So it's one. Okay. Guess I'm back to 1, 2, 3 and 4, and 1 contrast. And now I'm starting on the next row again, so I'm back to 1 and 1 and 1. If you do find that the contrast is getting to be too repetitive, you can just add a couple of base beads wherever you want, just to even it out if you like. So keep on working on that, and when I get to the end of my thread, I'm going to show you how to tie off the thread, which is a very, very important step. I've changed my matte color so you'll be able to see what I'm doing a bit more easily because of my white thread. When you have to move your thread from place to place, you never want to have it going obviously through beads like that because it's going to show. You never want to have it going up here again because it's going to show. To travel your thread, you're going to go either from neighboring bead to neighboring bead, and that way that thread is going to be, it's going to just slide between the beads and you won't see it. If I were in this bead, going from here to there is also going to have thread that's going to show. But to tie off, I'm going to, the system that I have works very, very well for me, and I haven't had any trouble. Basically, I'm going to go at an angle up 4 beads. I've already got through 1, so I'm going to go up through another 2 of them. What I plan on doing is actually making an X. Because my thread has already gone here, I'm going to go to this bead and then cross it, so that I'm actually going across it. I'm going to do that about 2 or 3 times. So now I'm going down 3 beads, and you can see my thread is going to get buried in that slot between the rows of beads. And it just disappeared. Now my last line went this way, so I'm going to go over to this 1 bead over here, and I'm going to go up and do that again through 3 or 4 beads. Or you can do 5 if you like. And that is never going to come out. Now I can click this thread, and now I'm going to show you how to add your next thread. The same way that we locked this off by basically doing X's, I'm going to do the same thing. So I can actually start anywhere away from where I have to finish here. So again, I'm just going to go through 3 or 4 beads. I didn't get very far on the piece of thread that I had before, so it was, this time I've got a longer thread. And I'm going to leave a bit of a tail just so that I don't lose track of it. And again, I'm going to go from the bottom of this bead to the bottom of that bead, and I can go up 3 beads. And that gets buried in there. And now I'm going to, I actually want to come out. You're going to be coming out where you left off before, which was in here. But instead of just going through that 1 bead, I prefer to go through the last 2 beads. So my intention, now I have to travel. I have to get from where the thread is here over to there, to that bead. So I'm just going to, I can do this. You can just simply travel across, or I want to do 1 more X. So that way I know that I never have to worry about the thread coming out. And I want to get from here up to there. So sometimes you end up sort of weaving through. I can go up here. And this is where I left off. So now I am ready to add my next bead. And in the meantime, I'm going to cut off this tail Some people like to leave them and do them all at the end, but I don't. They get in my way and make me crazy. So now I'm ready for my next bead. And I'm simply going to carry on with that organized random pattern that we've established. Okay, before we get too far along with the length of the bracelet, most of the sites that you'll go on where you're going to find instructions to do bracelet, they will always say to you, measure your clasp and then figure out how long you want the bracelet to be with the clasp, and you've got a lot of calculations to worry about. Instead, I would rather, at this point, add my clasp to my bracelet so that there's no calculation to worry about. I've got it attached, and when I'm working the bracelet, I'm just simply going to put it on and try it on. Because the clasp is already there, it's very easy to figure out how much more work you have to do. So I took my stop bead off, and my needle is threaded onto this tail that we left for adding the clasp. And with this one, I can just simply nestle those beads into each one. Perhaps I should have had an odd weave, an odd count to give me one more bead on the other side of that, but I didn't do that. So in the meantime, so I can either just fit this in like that, or I can put a string of beads to nestle between each one by just doing this and then adding a bead between each one and then weaving them in, working them in. So I can just do that, pick up a bead to fill in. Ouch! Ow! That hurt. I don't have a very high pain threshold, so when I get stuck, it really gets to me. So this is probably an easier way to get those beads lined up, and then once I have that finished or filled up, then it's easier for me to go and sew this back onto the bracelet. This is one option, and of course it depends entirely on the clasp that you have as to how you're going to. Now that I have that, now it'll be easier for me to simply go ahead and pick up, sew these things to get them attached. Another option is that if you have the horizontal clasp, you can simply, this is obviously a bit too short for this particular collection of beads, you can simply stitch them on like that, or you can overlap it to hide it, or you can use jump rings from here to pick up the threads. Another option is this clasp that I've used before. This I'm going to just simply put on top and sew through the parts of the filigree through the and pick up the threads from between the beads. And now, so we're going to just simply carry on. Once you've got your clasp on, carry on with your beading until you get to the length that you want, and then you're going to separate the clasp and then attach it to the other side of your bracelet. To deal with the odd count peyote stitch, you can see that things are lining up differently. On one side it looks the same here, but on the other side you have the bottom that matches. But when we put on our second last bead, I'm actually going to go up through the two top beads at an angle, because there's not a third bead like that, or top bead for you to go through. So the top ends up looking like this. Now to be able to add this next bead, we'll put that bead on, and it's going to go through this bead. Now we have our top bead like that, but we actually have to come back down through there to put on the next bead. So therefore my thread is coming from here. I'm just going to go across from this bead above it, oh, my tail is getting in the way. And now I can come in here and start the row. The trick is that we have to be in a position to be able to come down. We have to be able to get that top bead on, and then the problem is being in a position to come down that bead to be able to access the beads that are sticking up. Now this is looking kind of floppy. You can see the thread that I used for the sample is very fine compared to the 10 pound. This is actually a 4 pound. This is a 10 pound. You can see there's a big difference in size of the thread, and this is quite loose. And it feels very, very floppy compared to how nice and sturdy and together this is. So it does actually make a difference to have the correct weight of thread to support the beadwork that you're doing. So a larger bead, you do want to have a larger thread, which is going to help to support the weight of the beads and to make it sturdier, because this is just sort of, it's very, very loose. In here you can see that it's very easy to pull apart the beads. This one, that's not going to happen. So the structure changes dramatically not having the correct size or weight of thread. I'm going to show you a few of the most common mistakes. One of them, very often when you're going to the next row, people will forget and start here instead of picking up the first bead and going to that second bead. They will often forget that and simply go straight into that bead and then go to proceed, which basically is actually reducing. It's reducing the number of stitches that you have on your piece of work. A second mistake is to skip a stitch. So you can see that I've got my thread is here and there's no bead there. Another one that is probably most common is picking up 2 beads instead of just 1. Now this looks pretty exaggerated on this piece simply because of the size of my beads, but if you're doing a size 11 of a seed bead, for example, it may not show up quite quickly. And one way, instead of undoing all of that, you could actually take your pliers and break one of those beads if you really want to, if you don't want to undo everything. My rule of thumb, if I've later on find that I've made a mistake, is if I can readily see the mistake every time I pick up the piece, then I will reconsider undoing it to get rid of that mistake. Or basically, if I know the mistake is there, if I can live with it, then I could leave it. But actually, obviously, with this number of mistakes, it doesn't make sense to have it still there. So I'm just going to pull this bead to get that one undone, and I'll pull one of these beads to get the thread undone, and then I can rethread and correct it. And actually, one of my, I had mentioned earlier when I was starting with my clasp, it looked like I was probably 1 bead short. Oh, well, it's not sitting even, it's not balanced from the top and the other side, so it would probably be better if I had done an odd count weaving instead. So I think I might undo this and start again with an odd count, and that way I will have a bead on the outside of that loop and on the outside of this loop, instead of this just fitting just inside of that. Okay, I think I'm just about finished this bracelet, and because I put my clasp on earlier, it's easy for me to test the size to see if it's just about done. And I think I'm pretty well there. I think I'm going to just add 2 more rows. You can see it's, yeah, I just need a couple more rows. And because when I started this I had 2 white rows, I'm going to finish up with a couple of white rows. So I'll put on 1 more row white, or ivory rather, with the gold, and then finish off with the two cream colors, ivory colors. So I'm going to, and when I stop to tie off my thread, I prefer to do it in the middle of a row instead of at the end, because it's easier to maintain tension on those last beads. So I'm just going to, the same way that we tied things off, I'm going to start by pulling the thread. Oops, pulled it straight out. And do one more. To be careful where my thread is coming out. And it's coming out of there, so I'm going to go over here to make the X, to cross over that. Oh, the bracelet is stuck to the magnets on the mat. Sometimes you can only do 2 at a time. Just give that a bit of a pull, because I could see that there was I had a bit of a loop of the thread there, which obviously we don't want, so I'm just going to go through 2 more in here. And my thread is coming out here, so I'm just going to go up a couple more. And now I want to travel from this point, from this bead coming out, I want to go back down to there. So I'm going to go down these beads, and now I can go up in here, and I'm ready to add a couple more rows. And I'll come back when I've got those next 2 rows done. I just want to show you this. I have a bit of a mistake here, and this has to come off. And you may be tempted with your needle to go back through and unstitch everything by running your needle back through the beads that you came through. But don't do that, because what can happen is that when you're running with your needle through there, you might actually get the needle through the thread, and therefore it ends up making a big knot and a mess, and it's very difficult to deal with afterward. The simplest way to get back there is just simply to pull off the last beads to where you have to start resewing, and that way. And there's where the mistake is. I didn't go through this bead instead. I skipped that altogether. And that way you know that you're not going to end up with a big mess. So now that I've got that undone, I can just rethread the needle and fix my mistake, because it came from here, so I have to stitch in here. And now I'm back on track.